Song written based on May Sarton's poem, written by our own Angela, and sung so beautifully by Victor. Thank you so much. Linda Scromey gave me a beautiful book this past week. It's called Stitching Stolen Lives, the Social Justice Sewing Academy Project. It was founded in Oakland, and it's meant to amplify particularly voices of youth, to empower them, and also to build empathy through quilts and quilt making. It's a 21st century sewing circle, basically, right there in Oakland. It's art as a form of resistance and activism. And it's a beautiful book that you will not be able to make your way through without tears. These panels are made, and in this book you will find names like Ahmaud Arbery, whose trial starts this week. You will find Stephen Clark from Sacramento, Breonna Taylor, Michael Brown, George Floyd, Eric Gardner, the list goes on. These panels are meant to celebrate the lives beyond the headlines. These quilt blocks are made of those whose lives were taken by police brutality or race-based violence or gender-based violence or other violent means. They're displayed as public art as well. They're also sewn and given to the families. For centuries, humans have turned to quilts for comfort, for warmth, for ceremony, for art, and to share their voices. As I saw this, it also reminded me of the AIDS quilt, first called the Names Project quilt, a community trying to stitch itself together in the end of the 80s and throughout the 90s. How many of you have seen the AIDS quilt somewhere? It was started by Cleve Jones, a local San Franciscan. He was organizing the annual Candlelight Vigil March in 1985 to remember the assassinations of Harvey Milk and George Moscone in 1978. And for those who aren't local to San Francisco, Harvey Milk was the first openly gay supervisor, and George Moscone was the mayor of the city. And both were killed in a tragic way. As Cleve Jones organized that march in 1985, he also learned that already 1,000 gay men had died in San Francisco. And so he asked all those marching in the vigil to make a placard with their names. And so they did, and they marched down Market Street. And when they got to the federal building, somebody brought a ladder, and they began to tape the names to the federal building of all these placards. And as Cleve Jones and others looked up at that building, what they saw on that wall looked like a quilt, panels of a quilt, and thus became the Names Project AIDS Memorial Quilt. It was the most visible symbol of the AIDS pandemic, and right now it has 92,000 names, panels lovingly stitched. If laid out in its entirety, it would cover 1.3 million square feet. Each panel is 3 feet by 6 feet, which approximates a human grave. It's the largest ongoing community art project in the world. I remember seeing that quilt laid out on the Washington Mall in 1993 on the March on Washington. And I will never forget walking in between the panels laid out. It was as if each panel was sewn with grief and love. As I took it step after step, I felt outrage in the midst of sorrow. It stitched our memories together. And nearly almost overwhelming when I would run across a panel of someone that I knew that had died from AIDS. It reminded people like the Stolen Lives Project reminds people, that people are more than their deaths. They have full lives. The story we read from the book of Acts today, I've said that Acts is like the scrapbook of the early church. It's really also like a quilt of the early church. Stories stitched together, stories of a struggling community, stories of a community oppressed and persecuted, trying to find their own way and their dignity and worth in the midst of it all. And one of the stories that made it into this quilt, and I'm always fascinated, because there were hundreds, as you might imagine, of stories, but only certain ones get stitched into our memories. The story of Tabitha, the first woman disciple named in the book of Acts. Her name in English means gazelle. She was well known for her good works and acts of charity, and that's how she was remembered. And her friends, most of them widows, were in the room mourning her death. I want you to picture them singing and swaying around her bed, weeping and telling stories. And as they swayed and sang, they began to prepare her body for ritual and for burial. And at that same time, Peter was in town, and they sent for him, and he came. And they took him to the room where she was laid out. They began to show Peter tunics, clothing, hand him that and say, look, she made this for me. And another one, she made this for me. And tunics were outer clothing for warmth. Because remember, widows in that time had no power, no property, no rights. They were among the most vulnerable in society. And I imagine that it was Tabitha that drew them together, probably into some women's cooperative where they were able to make it together. Anybody with me so far? And can you picture it? They're not only picking up the things that she made them, but they're taking in the aroma. They're hugging it to their chest, because that's what you do when you lose someone. You find any visceral touchstone to be in connection with them. Peter sends them out of the room. He kneels and prays and speaks directly to the body. Tabitha, get up. And she does. And then he calls the widows back in and says, here you go, girls. Was this a true resurrection? I have no idea, do you? I don't know how these things happened then. But I do know this. This is a beautiful story of their experience of grief, and somehow, some way, life after death. And for whatever this story means or doesn't mean, it can offer us comfort in our own grief, solace in our own sorrow, gratitude in our own remembering. Tabitha helped these women stitch their lives back together, and she would always be remembered for that. She was woven into the tapestry of their lives. Here in the CCSM community, we've lost 3 saints in the last 2 weeks. And like Tabitha, all known for their good works and their acts of charity. And I know some of you online might have never met some of these people, but I want you to imagine them. You'll see their photos later on. I want you to imagine them with those of us that knew them so well. Marion Faber. Marion was a quilter. She's part of the Blanketeers. But what you may not know is that she also committed her life to volunteer organizations, including St. Anthony's Dining. She volunteered there for 42 years. She volunteered for Second Harvest, for the Redwood City Courthouse, for the Book Nook in Belmont, for the San Mateo History Museum. And then, of course, she was very involved here at the Congregational Church of San Mateo. She showed up to every memorial reception and made sure, headed that up, made sure that the families of the bereaved and those attending memorials had coffee, cookies, and tea afterward, no matter what. She supported many different charities. She made blankets for the homeless and underhoused. And during COVID, we estimate that she made more than 800 masks. Now, you couldn't really thank her because she wouldn't receive thanks, right? She showed her love by her service. She wasn't effusive with language. She was effusive with service. And then there was Arnold Duncan, head usher for, I don't know, a long time. Was always a step ahead of me. Anticipated people's needs, cared deeply about this church. Arnold was active as a docent and was the area coordinator for the San Francisco Opera a la carte and the San Francisco Symphony's Concert for Kids. He served as an inspector at the voting right precinct, the local voting precinct. He volunteered at the Legion of Honor and the DeYoung Museums. He gave talks on musical composers. And earlier in his life, he was active in a program called Christmas in April, which renovated homes for the underserved local community. And as always, when someone needed a ride, Arnold was more than willing to give it. And in fact, things that I know about him that maybe none of you do, I cannot tell you how often I would go to the mailbox in the office, and there would be an envelope with his distinctive handwriting with a check for whatever organization was in most need at that point. And I also know that he helped people one-on-one. They never asked him. He just sensed they might need it. And he gave it quietly and willingly. It was pretty hard to thank Arnold, too. He just... And then there was Elise Leung. She was a social worker for 33 years in San Francisco and helped some of the most marginalized people there. She sang in the choir, she helped out at memorials, and more than a few times, when I'd go to visit somebody in the hospital, she would have beaten me there and was sitting at their bedside. She loved to help out at the rummage sale. She loved pick-a parties. Many of you may not know this, but she was born in China and grew up in an orphanage until the age of 12. And until recently, she sat on the board of the Hong Kong Children's Garden, an orphanage in China. She stayed in touch with lifelong friends, 4 girls from that same orphanage that she shared a room with. And they've been in touch all these years. She called everybody on their birthday. She stayed connected. Lifelong friends from high school, too. She was gentle and humble, but she wasn't afraid to tell you what to do either. Less than a week before she died, I'd been able to see her, thankfully, in the hospital and visit her in San Francisco on hospice. Just a few days before she died, her son Robert texted me and said, "Penny, can you call my mom?" So I was out on a walk, and I picked up the phone and called her, and she answered. And she said, "I just love your prayers. Can you just say a prayer for me?" Now, let me think about it. Of course. And so I prayed with her over the phone. After I said amen, she just simply said, okay, good night. None of these people, or all of these people, would be so uncomfortable with me talking about them today in public. But too bad. Because their lives stitched together this community. And they are woven into the tapestry of our lives. And friends online, whether you know them or not, now that you are part of this community and you've heard their stories, they're now part of your lives as well. Because everything falls away, except the thread we followed unknowingly all along, that thread that strings together all that you've been and done. Your life, my life, is never the solo act that we think it is. But that thread, the thread of Arnold and Marion and Elise, has run its course in this lifetime. And now that thread joins our lives together in a magnificent tapestry. A tapestry, a masterpiece, which will live on. And so today, as we celebrate saints, remember that their thread weaves your lives together, weaves my life together, stitches our community together by good works, by acts of service, and by love itself. So as we celebrate all of our saints, remember they are with us still, part of that great tapestry of life. Amen.